Today we're going to talk about what are we running and how do we know it. Like if you are in the software business, it turns out you write software and you deploy a whole bunch of stuff in the firewalls, networks, databases, streaming. There's a million things. And this talk is going to talk about a little bit, run into a bunch of places where it's like we're trying to figure out what version of that did we put out there. Like why does that VNet look like that? Why does this look like that? I forgot to put firewalls, other things. Oh, I guess it's still part of networking. You know what? Let's stick with it. Okay, so this picture is totally meaningless. The whole point of this picture is this super simple system. Like I haven't even deployed anything with this few boxes on it in a while. And the question is, I got all these pieces out there, and what are they? And some of them, I want to know the version of the piece that's out there, and I want to know the version of the stuff that's sitting on the piece that's out there. So let's talk about that a little bit. I kind of have the feeling this is, I'm going to assume we're in the cloud and we are smart enough to know we need to version something, and we're smart enough to keep these two things out of the picture when it comes to deploying or putting things into production. And we're going to try and do things as code, because it turns out if we want to know what version of something is out there, the best way to do that is to version it, right? Is to somehow record what you're doing. And if we can do this in an automated fashion, we don't have to get all antsy about how much process we put in place. Let's figure out what we can do. So the bottom tier is resources, infrastructure. I'm assuming you're in the cloud. Everything in the cloud can be provisioned with an API. If it can be provisioned with an API, then you should be doing that, and the human hand should be removed, right? So if we can do this with an API, that means we can write scripts, or we can do templates. We can do Terraform templates. We can do ARM templates. We can do anything we want, right? Depending on what the infrastructure looks like. And in that case, we should, because that means we can version it. And then when we want to create something, we feed it the template or we feed it the script. If we version those, we now have versions, right? And so what we need to do is we want to version them. We want to version the configuration, version what we've got. And then when it's deployed, we need a way to figure out if that's the version that's out there, right? So there's the static design time part where we build this, and then there's the runtime part where we need to figure out if that's actually what's there. So I'm going to argue here that we can actually do this in the cloud with cloud resources. We can use templates and scripts, and almost every cloud system supports tagging, right? So the static version for infrastructure is going to be the code that we're going to use, and then that we can branch and we can figure out what versions we've deployed in the past. And if we use those scripts and we tag it, then that means we can actually ask the APIs at runtime, hey, what version's out there, if we use the right tags. I've worked places where it was mandatory that you tagged it with a version, and it was auto undeployed if there was no version tag. And I'm going to show you a stupid example of this, if I remember, at the end of this, right? So if we move up the stack, you know what? Before we move really up the stack, let's look at the build side of this. So the build part of this is, hey, we're going to put code out there. We're going to put schemas out there. We're going to do whatever. So a lot of places pay lip service to having good automation CI/CD. My view right now is if you are doing any manual deploys, and I know this sounds dumb in 2022, but if you are doing any manual, these things are deploying, you are completely busted. Like you will never know what's out there, right? Because you don't know what people did, and you do it with random permissions and other stuff. So let's start with the builds. The build is the entity that, and actually what it should say is code here, and not builds, but I will probably fix that in the blog anyway. And so code, if we do the build processes right, we can do code versioning, we can generate packages for this, we can tag the packages. That's the compile time part of it. And at runtime, if we have builds and we have packaging, then we should be able to interrogate the package, right? Or when the package is deployed, the deployment process should record what's out there somewhere. All right, now I got a table somewhere we can look at about this. And then we have deployments, right? That's code. So builds build code, they do stuff with it, they create configuration, like the configuration is code for the infrastructure, might actually be part of a build process, right? For deployments, when we do a deployment, right, we have a couple options. We know what version we want out there because in theory we created a script or code to do the deployment, or we created a deployment log in the deployment pipelines, right? When the code is deployed out there, though, the question is, how do we know what code's actually out there? How do we know what got deployed? And we're gonna argue here, actually, in a lot of systems, like if you were in Kubernetes or you're in some of these other systems, the deployed component can be tagged. You can add tags to it that you can query. And that's what you got to do. Everything, this is going to be the story of the day. Everything's tagged, right? And so we're going to tag, and it should be mandatory. I got code out there in Kubernetes, if it's in a container service, what version tags out there? What do I need to know? And I'll show you an example of some of the version tags I did. And then, it would be the same through for anything that's deployed. And then those deployments have APIs on them. They actually have other things, but let's talk about APIs for a minute. So if you have an API, we talked about versioning the infrastructure, versioning the code that goes on the infrastructure. Now we're going to talk about versioning the interface that we use to talk to the code that's running on the infrastructure. So APIs, my view, well, everybody should think this. APIs need to be versioned. I know a lot of places don't do it. They don't have good API hygiene. The problem is without versioning, without a way to know what version, right? You have no idea whether that thing broke because you did some weird version thing or because some other piece got busted, right? So there's a whole bunch of standards out there for API versioning. If it's a REST service, there are a couple different standards, and some people argue that versioning in the API is dumb, and I'm sure really smart people, crazy smart people, don't ever have to version anything. I am not one of those people. I need to know what's out there. So even we can either do it in the API itself, or some places I've worked, instead of actually putting it in the API, we actually had a metadata API on the deployment, and we could ask that API, hey, what version are you? What version are all these things? And we could pull that out of the build artifact, and then, so either the API itself will be versioned, or the metadata that describes the API will be versioned. Wow, I should have thought of that earlier for a white paper. Anyway, and so that's it, right? We version the resources in the code. We tag those when they get deployed. We build stuff with versions of the source code tree, and we tag the artifacts that we have that are the result of the build, right? When those are deployed, we record somewhere that we did a deployment, and then we have the ability to ask that thing either through API or through some other method what version is deployed out there. And that way we could build a dashboard on top. And then the APIs that deployment uses, right? We document that API in a way that can be queried at runtime. It's either explicit in the API itself, or we create a version API that people can call on it. And I've seen this also at places where we had no web API. We were doing all streaming, and we still put an API version API on it so we could find out what version is deployed. All right? And the beauty of this is a lot of this can be automated. Like I said, if you're doing your stuff by hand, you are dead. This is never going to work. I'm assuming you have some motivation to try and do infrastructure as code or configuration as code, right? So the other side, I want to go over the data side and the streaming data side a little bit, because the same thing happens there, right? We have data models, and it is amazing how bad the tooling is in a lot of cases for versioning data models, right? There are some awesome tools out there, but nobody ever wants to pay for them, or they only pay for a couple copies or whatever it is. And so again, we need to version the models the same way we do as versioning code, because the models are actually code. We're going to have scripts to do that, and then we run those scripts and we generate schemas, right? And then when we're deployed, we need to we need to be able to ask that version. So a lot of places I've worked, we created a table. Whenever we do a deployment, we put a record in that says what version we deployed into that database, and then we can do tieback, right? And the same story all the time. We build something, we need a version on it. When it's deployed, we need to be able to ask that thing what version is out there. All right, the last piece of this, like the other one here I'm looking at, I really love, like the only thing I really like about Kafka is the schema registry. It blows my mind, man. Avro schema versioning is amazing. And it's cool because it tells you whether the next release is going to work or not, or whether you're compatible or not. So if we look at messaging and streaming, we have payloads. They're a kind of data model, right? It's sort of like an API, but different a little bit, and that's why I broke it out. And so we will have to version the payloads. right? If we don't version the payloads and we have multiple producers and consumers, we have no idea what we're actually running out there, right? And we can use schema registries and other things to enforce it, right? So we version the payload, and then when we run this thing, we need the ability to ask what version of the schema we're using, or we need to be able to present the schema and find out if it will be accepted. So that's that, right? So that's it. We got to start at the bottom of the platform. We need to version the configuration and the code in all cases, and that would either be template or script code for infrastructure. It would be source code for, for business applications. It would be the API version that we would have. We would probably check that in or somehow generate the contract, right? And the data models and the payloads, we talked about that. And then at runtime, we need to be able to interrogate those. And for anything in the cloud, tagging pretty much works. And for things like Kubernetes, tagging works. And for things like data models, the best thing to do is probably create a table and web endpoints on all the business deployables. So let's go. I said all that repeatedly. Let's go back and look at this. In this case, and I'm over, so there will be no demo.